Hello and welcome to this week's What Were They Thinking? Among the news items we have for you this week are studies involving millions of Americans and the possible side effects from RNA vaccines. Data from Israel regarding booster shots, particularly focusing on the elderly. Vaccines for malaria being approved. And a rather unusual development with a controversial autism treatment about to go mainstream. The timestamps for these and other news items can be found in the description box below. Starting with studies involving over 6 million Americans and the somewhat arguable case for and against mRNA vaccines, is now largely a case purely for mRNA vaccines. The technology is not new. In fact, it's been in the pipeline for other drugs and treatments for various diseases, infections, and ailments for years now. That's what's allowed the COVID-19 vaccines to be developed at a record pace. It allows for a very quick reassembly of the scaffold that makes the vaccine and conversion into a new vaccine. Then they need to test its effectiveness, but they don't need to rebuild the vaccine from the ground up. Despite this, there has been an ongoing argument that the mRNA vaccines were developed too quickly, aren't proven to be safe, so on and so forth. This is why observational research from the CDC and from various other organizations, primarily private insurers, has tried to figure out just what degree of safety can be established. That's where those 6 million Americans come in. Since the middle of December 2020, the team has been following the medical records of millions of Americans who've received their vaccines for COVID-19. They've been tracking their health before and after vaccination. This is going to clearly demonstrate whether or not there is any relationship between having a vaccine and short, medium, and long-term side effects. What they've found after a year so far is that of the 6.2 million people who received at least one dose of mRNA vaccines and the 5.7 million people who received two, there was no evidence to connect it with any of 23 possible outcomes that could be considered serious. The researchers involved did recognize that there were a few limited cases of serious side effects, but that they were very rare and that none of them met the threshold to be statistically significant. They've also looked at other conditions, primarily those around heart inflammation. What they found were 34 cases in the period that's passed so far in those between 12 and 39. When they took these numbers and then applied them to the number of people who had been vaccinated, it meant there were 6.3 more cases of myocarditis in this age group than if they weren't vaccinated at the same time. This wasn't anywhere near the threshold required to become statistically significant. The research will continue on for another 2 years at least, with the same sort of monitoring to identify trends and outcomes, not only amongst those who have been vaccinated, but hopefully among those who haven't been vaccinated. That will give a much clearer image as to who and what should be vaccinated and how. If we are talking about the unvaccinated cohort, there are risks and concerns there that can't be ignored. There's an ongoing argument that being infected and developing natural immunity is better, and this has its truths and falsehoods as well. In the truth category, yes, the body does arrange for a greater variety of antibodies to be generated to a wider variety of antigen sites. On the other hand, the immune reaction is far less controlled and far more aggressive. This is what happens with most infections. Consider how you feel when you're infected with influenza versus how you might feel for a brief time after getting the influenza vaccine. There's a significant difference in the severity of the side effects to being infected, or in the case of a vaccine, vaccinated. Following that, you also need to consider just how long-lasting the protection is for what you could call natural immunity. According to research from the University of North Carolina, it is relatively short-lived, albeit quite strong. This has the problem that comes with that though, reinfection. And where you might be reinfected at 3 months if you have natural immunity, it can be 6, 12, or even more months if you are vaccinated. To a certain extent, this is why you need to be revaccinated every year for influenza. It's a new strain, and some protection from one year will carry through to the next. If you aren't vaccinated, you can be infected with the same strain of influenza multiple times in 1 year. This means that there are differing risks based on being unvaccinated and how often you're going to encounter and have to deal with the disease that your body's not prepared to deal with at that moment, that it will take longer to rally the immune system to deal with, and then ultimately leave you worse off, if only in time wasted in recovery versus being vaccinated. If you are going to be vaccinated, we should look to Israel for their data on the elderly. Specifically, that if you're over 60 and have been vaccinated, you have 1/50th, or approximately 2% of the rate of infection and then death from COVID than you do without it. Not only that, but then we need to look at the chances of getting ill, and by that we mean seriously ill, and you're 65 times more likely to get seriously ill if you are not vaccinated. This data follows on from Israel changing from a 2-shot regime of immunization to a 3-shot regime of immunization, which appears to have greatly improved the survival rates and reduced the severity of infections. If COVID-19 vaccines aren't all that interesting to you, then perhaps more practical and endemic diseases in other regions might be. Specifically, a vaccine targeted for malaria. The World Health Organization has further reinforced the recommendation that a vaccine for malaria for children in Africa be approved. Malaria is a parasite that gets in and infects the red blood cells. It multiplies, and then it comes through and it's picked up by mosquitoes. It's then carried by a new host where it's injected into them by the mosquito and continues to spread this way. It is a very difficult disease to get under control. There are, of course, medical treatments that go back hundreds of years, quinines being the most well established. There are, of course, newer medications and ways to prophylactically prevent infection. The prophylaxis comes with a range of side effects, and the treatments can often be quite expensive and difficult to maintain. Vaccines would solve this issue for the most part in its entirety. This is where the Mosquirix, which is the name for the malaria vaccine. Receiving the full 4 doses of the vaccine reduced infection rates by just under 40%. When the vaccine is used in combination with treatment, particularly prophylaxis, that number goes from 40% to 70% for reduction in hospitalizations and a reduction by 73% for deaths. Going from treatments for the known diseases of the world to treatments for diseases that are not so well known, specifically treatment-resistant depression. Most depression can be dealt with a combination of counseling and antidepressant medication. Occasionally, other medicines are needed to help bolster the effectiveness, but overall, they're relatively effective. There are, unfortunately, a percentage of the population for which this does not work. Possibly up to a third of people with depression. Treatments for this vary significantly, but the main ones have always looked at targeting the brain more directly. That's where a brain implant comes in. The brain implant was set up in such a way that it can continue to send a small electrical signal to the brain, and this would stimulate it. This would then help to mitigate the effect of depression. Rather than just constantly putting out this small electrical pulse to stimulate the brain, instead, it was wired in such a way that it could detect a variety of biomarkers, and then when the depression circuit was active, it could send out the pulse and deactivate it. Of course, such customized treatment isn't something that's easily done, and it's why there's only been one patient that they've successfully done so with to date. Finally, we go to Duke University and the treatment's being provided through the university's medical center. In this case, it's the use of cord blood or stem cells to try and treat autism. The problems with this are many-fold, not the least of which is that, for the most part, all the changes in the brain that lead to the neuropathology that are autism have occurred and are well and truly set in stone by the time the child is diagnosed. This means there is no way to alter the brain shape at that point. The cord blood and stem cell cures being offered and often being begged for to be funded on places like GoFundMe are not going to change that. In a less clear-cut but still relatively controversial territory is that these treatments are disputed at best and generally unproven. This means they're very experimental and incredibly expensive. This is why many parents are forced to go seek the funding from others to be able to do so. To receive just one course of treatment, which is a single infusion, it can cost between $10,000 and $15,000. That's under an expanded access program that's not part of the clinical trial. To add fuel to this fire, which should already be burning quite nicely, a for-profit company called cryo-cell International, with associations to Duke University and its researchers, plans to open clinics which will use these same treatments under a licensing agreement. These unproven, often controversial, and so far seemingly inefficacious treatments, the FDA may want to look into this. In fact, the FDA may want to look back at some older research which has been circulating from past clinical trials. The research was summarily described as not associated with improved socialization skills or reduced autism symptoms. Rerunning the same sort of clinical trials with the same methodologies isn't going to produce any new results unless they substantially change the process they're using, alter the type of cell and how they're doing it, or something else to significantly deviate from past clinical trials. Even then, they've yet to show any evidence that it actually works, which makes the idea of charging $15,000 per infusion to fund a for-profit company using an unproven treatment very unethical. While normally advice is little better than toilet paper, the article this time around does provide considerably more detail and goes into some of the more strident proponents for and against this particular line of treatment, and it is well worth a read for that. That's all the news items we have for you this week. Thank you for watching. If you found it interesting, consider liking, sharing, and subscribing. Please post any comments, questions, or suggestions that you have below.